Ben Hodges.
General Hodges, glad to see you on TV Rain. When do you think we can expect a full ceasefire, at least for those 30 days that have been discussed in such detail by representatives of the United States and Ukraine, but much less by the representatives of Russia?
I think that nobody wants a ceasefire more than Ukraine to stop the killing of innocent people. But I think also that Ukraine knows that getting an agreement, a ceasefire with Russia, is never going to be respected by the Russians unless there is something that will force them to live up to the agreement. And so I'm very skeptical about what I've heard so far today as a result of these conversations about a Black Sea ceasefire. All I see are concessions, requirements for concessions by the Ukrainian side. Russia has already been pushed away by Ukraine from the western part of the Black Sea. So all I can see is that it looks like Russia is asking for relief from sanctions. And I'm interested if Turkey also, is Turkey really okay with all of this? Because I think they would have something to say about what goes on in the Black Sea as well. So unfortunately, I'm skeptical so far.
Ну, то есть, вы считаете, что даже на Черном море не...
So you believe that even in the Black Sea, the shelling will not stop. I see that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is clarifying that he expects a halt to attacks on infrastructure, apparently including port facilities. He's also talking about stopping attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. This is what Zelensky himself is emphasizing, while the Americans haven't provided detailed comments on this yet, and Russian representatives even less so.
Well, certainly this is what President Zelensky should demand. If we're going to have a legitimate ceasefire, is that Russia would no longer attack Ukrainian port facilities or go after any sort of shipping. The problem is that Russia will, as always, look for every possible way to exploit any cracks or vulnerabilities until they are forced to comply. I mean, will they still drop bombs from Russian aircraft over the Black Sea into Ukraine? I doubt it. I mean, I doubt that they will treat that as part of the ceasefire. And so, look, I hope that this leads to something much bigger and better for Ukraine, overall ceasefire, which is necessary to get to actual negotiations afterwards. It's just that I have no confidence yet that Russia will live up to it unless somebody is there to enforce it and to inflict pain on Russia when they violate the ceasefire. So I'm still waiting to hear what kind of force or measures will be available to force Russia to have to live up to this ceasefire.
Этот вопрос, что интересно, обсуждали, очевидно.
This issue, interestingly, was apparently discussed by the participants of the negotiations in Riyadh, who exactly will oversee the implementation of agreements. But since everything is still quite vague, I'd like to ask you about European peacekeepers, which is a much more actively discussed topic. Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, repeatedly states that the deployment of such peacekeeping missions is unacceptable. What are the prospects here, in your opinion?
Well, of course, Ukraine is a sovereign country, and it's not up to Russia to decide who can come into Ukraine. They don't have any legitimacy to say who can or cannot come into Ukraine. So I think this is where Ukraine and European countries should disregard what Russia says. We spend way too much time worrying about what Russia says and what Russia might do instead of focusing on what needs to be done. So I'm disappointed. It's unfortunate that my own country has not agreed to be part of any kind of a ceasefire implementation force. But Europe has enough capability if they can figure out how to work together to actually provide this.
В данном контексте...
In this context, it is also interesting to look at what is happening on the ground right now. I know you're following developments closely and have access to information. So just moments ago, Volodymyr Zelensky stated, the situation on the front is quite good for us right now. At the same time, there are reports that Ukrainian forces are allegedly advancing in Russia's Belgorod region. What is your assessment of the current prospects on the battlefield?
I think that exactly what President Zelensky has said, that the Ukrainian forces have stopped the Russians. The Russians do not have the ability to overrun or break through Ukrainian defenses. I think that Russia is in more trouble than maybe many in the outside realize. Yes, of course, it's difficult if you're a Ukrainian soldier fighting and Ukrainian civilians that are getting killed almost every night. But on the battlefield, I think that Ukraine is in a much better position than are the Russians. And so the Russians, of course, want to see this end. They want some kind of end to it. So for relief, because they cannot keep this going, I don't believe. And their only hope is that the U.S. will side with the Russians somehow.
Понятно, но вот вы говорите...
But you say that not everything should depend on Russia. On the other hand, Donald Trump, the president of your country, is essentially negotiating over Zelensky's head directly with Vladimir Putin. They are reaching some kinds of agreements, and then Ukraine is presented with what seems like ultimatums. What can be done about this? And do you think Ukraine can avoid losing the war if the US were to completely cut ties and withdraw its support?
Yeah, well, first of all, I hope that never happens, that the U.S. discontinues aid, because not only because we're inspired by Ukraine, but because it's in our interest. It's in the interest of the United States that Europe, including Ukraine, is stable and secure and prosperous. And so that means we need this war to end with Ukrainian sovereignty and Ukrainian people being protected and respected. So I hope that my president does not throw away this opportunity that Ukraine has provided us. But if he does, and if we if the administration only takes the Russian side, then I think this is where Ukraine and Europe and perhaps Canada will still have to do what's necessary to protect Ukraine, because of course Europe does not want to see millions more Ukrainian refugees coming in, or continued disruption of food and energy supplies. That affects Europe. So it's in Europe's interest that Ukraine is successful. And of course, nobody in Europe wants to see a war with Russia expand into the other European countries. So I think at the end of the day, Europe can provide enough to help Ukraine, even if the U.S. fails.
Ну, тут нужна политическая воля.
Well, political will is needed here, obviously, and we will discuss that further in the broadcast. In general, you commended US forces in Europe. Are the United States withdrawing their troops? If they do withdraw, what would be the consequences? As you know, there have been reports on this in the Western press. How likely is this scenario?
I think that this administration has been talking for quite some time about its desire to shift focus to the Indo-Pacific region. And also, this administration has been talking for quite some time about the need for our European allies to take on more of the burden. And I think both of these are reasonable. That means probably that the United States will significantly reduce its presence in Europe at some point. I hope that this reduction, whatever decisions are made, will be based on a very professional strategic analysis about what do we still need to do to protect our interests in Europe and all of our friends, including Ukraine, even as we reduce the number of troops that are in Europe. I think it's almost inevitable that there will be some reductions. I don't want to guess at this point how much.
Понятно. Ну, в перспективе, в ближайшей...
Looking at the near future, do you think Ukraine might be able to artificially force Russian troops to relocate to defend Belgorod from Kursk? And is it true that there is some kind of cauldron in the Kursk region, as Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump, and other US officials have repeatedly mentioned, claiming that thousands of Ukrainian troops are encircled and that only Putin has the power to spare their lives?
I think this is a false narrative from the Kremlin, which unfortunately was echoed by the White House, that somehow Russians had encircled thousands of Ukrainian troops in Kursk. This was a total fairy tale. I think that the Ukrainian staff and commanders have done a very skillful job of pulling people out of the Kursk bridgehead. I do hope that there is yet again another Ukrainian counteroffensive into the Belgorod region. Every commander, good commanders, want the initiative. You want the enemy to react to you instead of you always reacting to the enemy. And so if these reports are accurate, and I've heard a lot in the last few days that Ukraine is making some advances inside Belgorod, I think this is another example of Ukraine having the superior understanding of how to fight a war, as well as the superior will. They just need the logistics and weapons to help them be successful.
Да, что ж, большое спасибо.
Thank you very much. There was Ben Hodges, retired lieutenant general and former commander of the US Army forces in Europe, live on TV Rain.